Jeanette Brode served as the Director of Lifelong Learning at Temple Sholem in New Milford for over a decade. She earned her certification as a Holocaust educator from Echoes and Reflections and serves as an educational consultant for Voices of Hope, an organization of descendants of Holocaust survivors. Jeanette has been a docent at University of Hartford's Museum of Jewish Civilization and is the recipient of the university's 2018 Joseph Karinznik Memorial Educator Award. In an early career, Jeanette was the vice president of the Children's Book Council, a publisher trade league in New York City. She currently works in the children's room at the New Milford Public Library and is book reviewer for the Sidney Taylor Schmooze, a book blog sponsored by the Association of Jewish Libraries.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Good morning.
Oh, I may not stand here. We'll see if you can hear me if I walk away. I must say that despite all that, my most important identity is probably as the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. Take a look at that. I didn't realize. All right, if I talk over here, can you hear me? Is that going to be all right? Okay. Does this look familiar to anybody? Anybody have any idea what that is? Just with a show of hands or not? Few people. This is the Jewish star that the German Jews had to wear as of 1941. You can find them in any language. Jude means Jew in German. This was my mother's star. To me, it represents the epitome of othering, of victimization, of taking one part of your population and alienating them until they are invisible to everyone else. This was my mother's personal star. She kept it in her night table drawer so that what happened during the Holocaust was always with her. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about her story, her family story, and then later a little bit about my father's story. But first, to give you some context, in 1931, Germany passes the Nuremberg laws, and slowly rights are eroded. Citizenship is taken away from my mother, who was a teenager at the time. There's no movies, no theaters, no concerts. You can't walk in the park. Ultimately, you can't get on public transportation. For her parents, this meant the loss of business, the loss of access to their bank accounts, and a world that got smaller and smaller. This is a family tree. We're not going to go through my family tree, but what I want to point out is, as of now, we're talking about 5 generations who've been affected. So we'll start the story with my great-grandfather, my grandparents, my mother's generation, my generation, and now my kids who also carry the legacy of this. So this is my mom as a little girl. That's her on the far right. The other 2 people are her brothers, Heinz and Fritz. Doesn't get more German than that. They were a very assimilated family. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her story. And then that young girl in the middle there is her cousin Ilza, probably her best friend growing up. They were part of a large kind of extended family that ran in and out of each other's homes and spent a very, very happy youth together. Great. You spent a bit. Is it on?
It should be. You guys got it?
Is it on? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great. So they spent their youth together as children in what was a very happy family. This is another cousin, unfortunately also named Ilza, which makes the story complicated, with her brother. She's a little, although younger here, she's a little bit older than my mother. I tell the story of kind of these three girl cousins. One who left, one who tried to leave, one who stayed behind. They all survive. They are reunited in New York after the war, so. And this is Breslau. It's a beautiful city on the river. It's in the northeast Germany, now it's Poland. It was a happy childhood. what I can say about life there, but I can also tell you, as the Jewish community is more and more under constraint, Hitler arrives there in 1941 to celebrate the German Song Festival at the local fairgrounds. This is the family business. Several of my mother's uncles, as well as her father, worked in the business. My grandfather started the business. It is Aryanized, confiscated. This is my grandfather's house. My great-grandfather's house. From this property, he can see the business that is no longer his. In 1938, there is the Night of Broken Glass, a night of state-sponsored terror against the Jews. Tens of thousands are arrested. Jewish businesses are vandalized. Jewish synagogues are burned, hence the Night of Broken Glass. On that night, one of my mother's uncles is arrested, and the rest of the men in the family go and hide in the basement of the house. The next morning, my mother's aunt goes to the police station to find out if she can get any information about what has happened to her husband. And the police station is filled with women asking the same question. The men stay in hiding for several days out of fear of arrest. My mother's uncle is let free after about 10 days with the understanding that they will leave the country, and they, in fact, emigrate. So that's those two people with the little girl, Ilza, that you saw earlier. This is the other Ilza, who you saw earlier with her brother. In 1939, a ship leaves Germany called the St. Louis, and it's bound for Cuba. And when it arrives there, it is not allowed to dock. And it is turned away from every port. It's at sea for quite some time until 4 European countries decide that they will take some of the Jews back into the country. My mother's cousin and her family, her brother, husband, and parents disembark in Belgium. The men are ultimately arrested and taken to a work camp. Miss Ilza and her mother successfully hide for a while. Ilza has false work papers. They move often so as not to be detected. They ultimately are arrested and deported to Auschwitz, where her mother dies. She ends up working in a munitions factory where she joins other women in sabotaging German military apparatus. This is my mother's acceptance letter to the Jewish hospital in Berlin. When the schools are closed to her in 1938, she applies to the Jewish hospital to go into nurses training. She is accepted, and she leaves Breslau and moves to Berlin in the spring of 1939. So it's really in 1939 that this family disperses. One attempt to get on the St. Louis and leave, one who successfully emigrates to New York, another uncle who moves to South America, and my grandparents who choose to stay. This is a photo taken of the staff at the Jewish hospital. You will notice that the nurse in the middle is wearing that Jewish star I showed you earlier. That's my mother on the right there. When I think about the hospital, I grew up with a lot of stories about the hospital, but when I think about it now, I think about it as a place where people in the face of adversity try to maintain their humanity. There are, quite honestly, after deportations are announced in Germany, there are suicides in the city, and these people are brought to the Jewish hospital where the staff does their best to aid them. The hospital acts as a deportation center, sometimes called a ghetto, sometimes called a camp on its own. These deportations leave regularly to go to Theresienstadt, which was seen as the model concentration camp. My mother wants to go, and she always credited the doctor who didn't let her go with having saved her life. These people edit medical records, they make food for the people at the deportations, and I grew up with stories of my mother removing her star and going out into the city of Berlin with her friends. Because she always said we were young and we didn't know what tomorrow would bring. And they would go to the cafes, and she would go and get her hair done. And once she and her friend even saved up for a fancy dinner, and they went to a very nice restaurant in the heart of Berlin where the Nazi headquarters were, and they had a bunch of Nazis seated at a table next to them, and they left the restaurant as quickly as possible. This is a letter from my mother's brother in Old German script. I spent the last few years getting a trove of letters that my mother saved from her family, translated and transliterated, and I have come to know many of these relatives who I never met. So my mother's two brothers are moving around, working in agricultural camps, training to get skills in the hopes of going to Israel. Both of them are ultimately arrested. They die in Auschwitz. They arrived there several months apart, and now I am left wondering, since I don't really know what happened to them, like, did they know one another there at the end or not? The letters tell the story of a family who doesn't know what's coming. They are a loving family, trying to help one another. You know, they say things like, did you get the jam? Did you get the cookies I sent? Do you need more material for a winter coat? But also there's an undercurrent of, did you get the document signed? Have you been to see the lawyer? Have you heard what happened to so-and-so? Did it work out all right? The Jewish world for these people is getting smaller and smaller. This is my grandmother, Johanna. I'm named after her. In the debates about whether or not my grandparents should leave Germany, she takes the hard line and she wants to leave. But my grandfather, Wilhelm, who was a World War I hero, says, we are safe, we will never be hurt, we're going to stay, and so stay they do. But ultimately, they get word of deportation in 1942. And this is a travel permit that allows my mother to go home, and because she wants to see her parents before they are deported. And she, in a piece of writing I found of hers, she writes, we walked the rooms not knowing what you should take. We walked the 6 rooms of the apartment. And my grandmother was only allowed to take 1 knapsack with her. My grandfather, by this time, is already ill. He's had a stroke. He's taken to the concentration camp in a wheelchair. And they survived there for a while. These are postcards that my grandmother sends from Theresienstadt. You'll notice like the Hitler stamp on the upper right side. My grandmother writes to my mother in code to try to give her information about how she is and what's going on. One of the postcards was signed Fritzelbrot, and it took me, I don't know why it took me so long, but it took me a long time to figure out that Fritzel was her son, Fritz, and he had sent bread, and that's what she is acknowledging in the signature. But my mother also finds out that her father has passed away when her mother signs the return address widow. And in the bottom postcard here is signed Johanna Weg, which means away. So my grandmother is telling my mother that she is also about to be deported. This is in 1944. She's ultimately sent to Auschwitz and perishes there. And the war is ending, this is correspondence through the American office in Berlin. So my mother is establishing contact with her cousin who left before the war, and those early letters are all about what happened to this one. Have you found out anything about this one? Do we know where so-and-so is, as they're trying to kind of reconstruct the family and figure out who survived. My mother, in her correspondence, is always writing that she's waiting for the boys, which are her brothers, to come back from the East, and they never do. And this is my mother at Checkpoint Charlie. Berlin is now a divided city after the war. The city is in chaos. If there were shortages of food and heat and clothes and supplies before the war, they continue after the war. She finds herself in the French district, and she desperately wants to get out. She desperately wants to get out of Germany. She writes, now nobody is a Nazi, meaning during the war, everybody had a uniform and you could tell who the enemy was. And now everyone's in plain clothes and you have no idea like who's who. You're free to walk the streets, but the streets still don't seem safe. My mother is liberated by the Russian army in the final weeks of the war. They have taken all the patients down to the cellars and the tunnels that exist below the hospital, and they spend like 2 weeks there without information of what's going on above them. Ultimately, they are liberated by the Russians. Someone has taught them to say, a Russian who's a patient in the hospital, all the patients were Jewish, all the staff was Jewish, has taught them to say, we're Jews, and the response they get from the Russians is, there are no Jews. This Jewish hospital survived under the auspices of the Nazi. Eichmann, who was head of the SS, has offices on the premises throughout the war. Increasingly, the SS is taking over more of the buildings, so the hospital is being consolidated. The hospital has served as some kind of like political pawn between the Gestapo and the SS, the branches of the military police. The Jewish hospital not only survived the war, but continues today as an old age center. This is Ilza, who survived the St. Louis, reunited with my mother after the war at the Jewish hospital. This is my parents on their wedding day in 1948. They are outside the offices of the Berlin city municipality. So my father has arrived in around 1946, and the calls to leave diminish as they become further involved. This is their ketubah, which is a Jewish wedding contract. So when I look at this, I see a real affirmation of faith after hardship. And I think for a moment how different that faith looks now, because if before the war your religion is about community and family, you have lost all of that and you have to choose to rebuild as you can. And this is my parents in 1953 emigrating to the US, and that my brother has already been born by then. If you'll see documents, and I guess it's a newspaper and documents in my father's hand, they arrived stateless. My father both become American citizens. They are very patriotic. They value citizenship greatly, having lost it in their lives. This is the Ilza with whom they are reunited in New York, now grown up. And this is my father as a young man, a little bit about his story before he arrives in Germany. He is the middle child of 5. 3 do survive the war. His parents do not. He is from a small town in southeastern Poland, I guess. There is a story that I grew up with, is that he saw his parents shot and he ran to the woods to join the partisans. The partisans were the resistance fighters. He stays in the environs around his hometown so that he can later liberate the town with the Russian army. There is, I'll show you this first. This is a post-war photo of my dad with some partisans in Russian uniforms. That's my father on the far right, and I know this to be a childhood friend of his from the town of Lezhins. I assume, I cannot find out, that they survived together. 11 people, 11 Jews returned to the town of Lezhins after the war. And one night, they are together in a meeting place, and there is a group of Polish nationals who come through, who hear that there are Jews present, and they throw a bomb into the premises. This is after the war, and so if you have any illusions about the war being over and anti-Semitism, going away and, life getting back to normal, there is no back to normal for these people. Several people are killed. My father is injured. Hence, he arrives ultimately at the Jewish hospital as a patient. My mother is his nurse, and we know the happy ending to that story. I have been trying to piece together what happened to my father's family. My mother was open about her stories about the hospital. My father never spoke about what happened. Many of the Polish towns put together what we call a Yisker book, which is a memorial book about what happened in the town. My father did not speak to them, and when a published copy of the book arrived at our home, he turned to me and he said, I should have spoken to them. They have a lot of it wrong. So now I've gotten access to that book, actually in an English translation, and when I read through it, I don't know what in there is true or not true. So much of this is about lost stories that I personally, for my family, am now trying to reclaim. And I began my research at an organization in Israel called Yad Vashem, which is an archive research center memorial to the Holocaust. And there's a cousin who left before the war who has submitted testimony. This is a page of testimony about my grandmother, attesting to that there was an action, a pogrom in 1942, in which those Jews that had remained in the town and lived in the ghetto are shot. So I'm still trying to put together the pieces of what happened to my family. Also at Yad Vashem, they have a program called The Righteous Among the Nations. And in doing the research, I discovered the name of someone who was helpful to my father's family. That's my father on the right, and the gentleman we're talking about is on the left. He has been named Righteous Among the Nations in Israel. And I bring this forth for many reasons, but also to make the point that if you did survive, no one survived alone. And finally, this is as we go deeper into Yad Vashem, this is a document that was in the file, signed by my father with 7 others. They call themselves the remaining Jews of Lezhins, attesting to what this gentleman did for them and for others in the community during the war. The irony of this is that this document is signed in Breslau in 1945, which is the town my mother left in 1939. So to give you some perspective, we're talking about 6 years of history and what can happen in those 6 years. And if you look at the kind of history, Germany is really a failed republic, a failed democracy. Hitler comes to power with the decline of the Weimar Republic, and that's how people lose their rights. So democracy is an ongoing investment for like all of us. When I look at my parents' story, one of the things I'm very proud of, I'm very proud to be their daughter, is that they exercise agency. So my message to you is, there's always something you can do. You always have choice in how you respond, you always have choice of your actions, and you are ultimately like responsible. I have accepted this burden to bear witness to these stories, to tell them, because I think it's important. It's my legacy, it's my responsibility, and in inviting me here today, you too have become witnesses. I hope these stories inspire you, and I hope you learned something. Thank you.